What is the story behind the Chabad Machzor? In the first part of today's lesson, we find ourselves comparing two sacred machzorim. We have on the one hand the current Chabad Machzor open before us, focusing on the Shachris of Rosh Hashanah. At the same time, we are also looking at images of an Ashkenazi Machzor dating back to the 1200s. Our purpose? To discern the commonalities and distinctions between them. Once we have this understanding, we will embark on the path of tracing how we got from there to here. We uncover that there were diverse perspectives within the Chabad community concerning the role of the piyyutim during the 19th century. And ultimately, the transformative moment in this story is the official publication of the Lubavitch Machzor, which happened in the year 1941. Please note, as I gave this class, I sometimes struggled to say the words Yoresi Biftsoisi properly, so I apologize for that. If you'd like to see the images of the medieval Machzor, there is a link in the show's notes. I'm looking now at the Rosh Hashanah Machzor. Our focus is going to be just Shachris of Rosh Hashanah, and I want to begin with a question. It's a question that I've actually had for a long time, and the answer is a very simple answer, as we're going to soon see. And that is, we all know that the davening on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, whether it's Shachris, whether it's Musaf, whether it's Mincha, most of these tefillos are laced with extra material known as piyyutim, pieces of liturgical poetry. And I understand the piyyut. Someone writes a composition, we'll talk about who later on. Someone writes a composition, they feel really good about it, they conveyed a point, they conveyed an idea, it's an artistic piece. I'm used to that. What's interesting about Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur is the number of one-liners that are lacing the tefillos. So in other words, if Shachris Rosh Hashanah, the Chazaras Hashatz, begins with a paragraph, Yoresi B'tzvoisi Siach Lahashchil, okay, someone wrote a piyyut. The next paragraph also, it's a full paragraph. But what happens is, all of a sudden, we get bombarded with a whole bunch of one-liners. So for example, on page 112 of the Machzor that I'm using, which is the new edition of the Kahas Machzor, you have a line of Na Levadin, one line. What goes into the background of an individual sits down and says, I'm writing a composition of one line? Likewise, on the next page, on page 113, after we say Melech Memis Umachayim Asmich Yeshua, we have one line, Melech Elyon V'Noira. That's the second one. There are more examples. The top of page 114, Yimlech Hashem Le'olam. All of a sudden, we have two random lines. These are taka psukim, but what are these random psukim doing over here? I get that. That's a song. That's a piyyut. That makes sense to me. These one-liners are bizarre. You go down further in the page. There's a one-liner, another one-liner, another one-liner. Further down on the page, another one. This is a constant theme in the davening of Rosh Hashanah and the davening of Yom Kippur. And it's obviously bizarre. And as I said before, the answer is rather simple. But dafka by exploring and learning about the history and the evolution of the Machzor that we have, the Chabad Machzor, and understanding where it came from and where it is, then we'll have a better understanding of why it is in this particular way, and we'll have an answer to this question. All right, so we're going to begin our story tonight by talking about the following individual. His name is Archbishop William Laud, who lived between the years 1573 and 1645. He was obviously an important person in English history, and his end wasn't too glorious. He was actually beheaded on charges of treason in the year 1645. But before that happened, he was a collector of important books and manuscripts, including Judaica. And in Germany at the time, in the 1600s, there was something called the 30 Years' War. And anytime there's war, there's chaos. Chaos spells opportunity for some. And the result was that a number of important manuscripts that were in different places in Germany ended up in his collection during this time. It's not entirely clear how. We're going to be looking today at one particular manuscript from this collection, which eventually made its way to the Bodleian Library in Oxford. It's known as the MS Loud 321, and we're just going to refer to it tonight. Whenever we're referring to it, we're just going to say manuscript 321. It was composed, meaning it was written around sometime around the year 1270, and that's assessed by the parchment, by the calligraphy, by the writing style, etc. And the nusach is nusach Ashkenaz. Now, when it comes to nusach Ashkenaz, generally speaking, there are three classes within nusach Ashkenaz. This may become important later. Although it's just one thing, Ashkenaz, there are actually variations between Jews in France, Jews in Germany, and Germany itself, Western Germany on the Rhineland, and then further east in Eastern Germany. So this Machzor is going to reflect the Western Ashkenazi nusach. And what we're going to do is we're going to use this Machzor 321, we're going to use it as our base, because it really is the base of our Machzor. Our Machzor that we're holding here today in our hands is the progeny of this Machzor, just with many different changes and variations, as we are going to see. And so we'll learn a lot by comparing what we have today to what we're going to have in this particular manuscript. This is going to sharpen so much about what's going on in our Machzor. So that's pretty much what we are going to do. The first part of today's shiur is just to compare what do we have compared to this 13th century manuscript. So let's open up to the Tefillos of Rosh Hashanah, and we open up here, and we notice right away an initial word where it says in fancy gold letters, Melech, and on the side there is some imagery. Our focus tonight is not going to be imagery, but we'll just move this out of the way. Will allow us to see what this is and talk about it for 20 seconds, and then we'll focus on the liturgy itself. So this is the opening page of the Rosh Hashanah davening, so it's not surprisingly that there is an artistic piece. And what we have on the right-hand side of the word Melech is an angel, indicated by the wings, holding a scale, which makes a lot of sense because Rosh Hashanah is Yom Hadin, and that's an image of, are you going to have more schusim? Are you going to have more the opposite of schusim? And the angel is depicted with an animal face. This is something that we're all used to already in these Dalet Amos. We've discussed this many times, and we're not going to review that subject again, or why that was so. Suffice it to say that during the 13th century in Ashkenaz, this is a very common way for how to depict faces. And on the left-hand side, there is someone sitting, again an angel, as indicated by the wings, and it appears that he's holding one pen in each hand, which is the idea of Yom Hadin, again, writing down and signing in the book of life, is probably what is being conveyed over here. Okay, so that's in terms of the image, and now let's go back to the liturgy, and what are we looking at over here? So what we're looking at over here is what's known as a Yotzer, and that is, we say in Shachris, the first bracha of Birchas Krishma, we say Yetzereru veri cheshech, Eisa Shalom veres hakoil, and in the weekday we say Hamer la'aretz. On Shabbos we say Hakol Yoducha. In other words, Shabbos we have something special there that's not part of the weekday davening. So just like Shabbos you have something special, wouldn't it make sense that on a special Shabbos or on a Yom Tov you should have a special tefillah known as a Yotzer that is there instead of the Hamer la'aretz? And that was taka, the old minig in Ashkenaz. Not only Rosh Hashanah, and not only Yom Kippur, but not only Shalosh Regalim, but also on the Shabbos of Dalet Parshias and many other weeks as well. So that's what we're looking at here. They would say, Yotzereru veri cheshech, and right after that bracha, instead of saying Hamer la'aretz, they would say this piyut that is known as Melech. Obviously, in our Machzor, this doesn't exist. On the left-hand side of the page, you'll see I circled it with a red circle. It says oifon, and that word oifon is telling you that this is the second part of this series. In other words, the first part, Melech, is said by the words Yetzereru veri cheshech, but then further on, when you say Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh Hashem Tzvakos, Maloich ha'aretz kvoidoi, so this is, the next word is va'ofanim, so you stop right there, and then you say this piyut over here that's called kvoidoi. There was usually 3 piyyutim in this series. The third one would be called the Zulas, and that would be said when you say Ein lanu oid elikim zu lascha, which in the minig of Ashkenazi they didn't have the word sela, just said ein lanu oid elikim zu lascha. So then they would say the third piyut over there. For various reasons, we do not have that in these machzorim. We only have a piyut for yoitzer and we have a piyut for oifen. We do not have a piyut for zulas. So the Rishonim discussed it, but I don't want to get into that right now. And again, obviously, these two piyyutim are not part of our davening. We say the regular material that we say on a regular weekday or on a regular Shabbos if Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbos. We turn to the very next page in this machzor, and the top few lines is the conclusion of that oifen, and then we have big words that says oschil, and you'll see that on the left-hand side it says kedushta, and kedushta is the name of this piyut that is beginning. So what's happening here? We're about to begin Chazaras Hashatz. In other words, this machzor is not containing the everyday liturgy. He assumes that you're using the siddur for that. Now that you use your siddur, you said the Sh'tila Shemona Esrei, which included also the special tefillah that you say for Rosh Hashanah, which is also part of the siddur. That's not what the machzor is for, at least not this machzor. Now you come to Chazaras Hashatz. When you come to Chazaras Hashatz, we're going to do something special. And this something special we call a kedushta, because all these piyyutim are about leading into and deepening the experience and enriching the kedusha that we are going to say. So how does the kedushta begin over here? It begins with oschil. Now if you look in our machzor, we have material before oschil. On the left-hand side of the page, you see there's oschil on page 111 in the machzor. You see that there's oschil. So that is a good match, but we have additional material over here. First we have misoid chachamim, and then we have yoresi b'tzvoisi. Now you'll notice if you look at this manuscript, you'll see that material, you probably can't read it from where you're sitting, but that material of misoid chachamim and yoresi b'tzvoisi is written into the margin of the text. In other words, it wasn't part of the original nusach over here, but already at an early date, remember this manuscript moved from Germany to England sometime in the 1600s, so definitely before then, though I don't know if anyone can pinpoint exactly and say when this happened, where someone came and said, hey, there's additional material over here that needs to be here. We need to put in Misaid Chachamim, and we need to put in Yoresi B'tzvoisi, and indeed they did. The question is going to be why originally was Yoresi B'tzvoisi not there? And that's something that we're going to return to later. So let's talk for a minute about what is Misaid Chachamim and what is Yoresi B'tzvoisi. All these have names, and that's because there's a structure, there's a logic to what's happening over here, and the name is Reshus. And there's two types of Reshus. The first type of Reshus is Misaid Chachamim U'Nevoinim. And this is basically saying, you know why it's a good idea for me to add piyyutim into the davening? Because I'm not making this up on my own. I'm getting it from somewhere. It's Misaid Chachamim U'Nevoinim. This is coming from, it's based on Mamarei Chazal. It's based on the teachings of the Chachamim and Nevoinim. And so therefore, don't look at me crazy that I'm adding piyyutim into my davening. It makes a lot of sense that I should do it. So in other words, it's a reshus. It's a justification for all these additions. That's the Misaid Chachamim U'Nevoinim. What's the Yoresi B'tzvoisi? The Yoresi B'tzvoisi is a different type of reshus. Here, it's more the Chazan speaking. And the Chazan is saying, listen here, you may look at me and say, who am I to represent the Kehillah? I'm not good enough. So you're right, I'm not good enough, but I'm still asking the Eibishter that he should give me the words that I should be able to do this right. The more famous iteration of this is when we say Hineni. But Hineni is actually a much later tefillah. It's not found in any of the medieval manuscripts. It seems to appear sometime in the 16th century. The original Hineni is this Yoresi B'tzvoisi and other piyyutim like it that are said here in Shachris. So again, Misaid Chachamim U'Nevoinim is more the reshus on the material that I'm doing is good material. The Yoresi B'tzvoisi is more the reshus on God is going to help me, so even if I'm deficient in one way or another, I could still do this. And this is the reshus. In this manuscript, none of these are here, which meant that these l'chayra were not being said at a certain point. But there were other traditions in Ashkenazi that did have it, and it made it in here. And I'm holding it as a question for why wasn't there originally, why did it make it in later? Yoresi B'tzvoisi begins with a yud, and that's because it spells out a person's name. I'm not sure why this Chabad Machzor and most Chabad Machzorim do not give you the names of the piyyut. In other words, you're able to see. It spells the name Yukusil. There's a man Yukusil. He lived in the 11th century. He's the one who wrote this particular piyyut. And the fact that he wrote it is going to be the reason why it's not here, as we're going to see later on. So let's hold on to that. Once we finish with the reshus, now our Machzor and Machzor 321, we're on the same page, because we're holding now oschil. So what is oschil? So Aschil is very simple what's happening here. What's happening here is we're saying a bracha. Baruch atah Hashem Magen Avram. It began with Baruch atah Elokeinu v'Elokei Aviseinu, and it's ending with Magen Avram. We need to add some flowering into this tefillah. We need to add some haisafa into this. Misaid Chacham and Yoresi didn't add anything. All of that is the shus. We didn't do anything yet. Now we're really going to do something. What are we going to do? We're going to add content that is going to be somewhat related to this first bracha, as we're going to see. That's what Aschil is. We have it here and we have it over here as well. However, there is a difference. Our paragraph ends with the word nifkada, which you have over here in the screen as well. But you're able to see on the right-hand side of the page that after we say Tasher Asher Bo Nifkada, what happens is you have over here psukim, which we do not have in our machzor. It says kakosov, and it brings a pasuk Vashem Pakad Asara Kasher Omar, which is the Kriyas HaTorah of the first day of Rosh Hashanah, and then it brings another few psukim, which ending with the word Nala, and then you go Nala Badin, and then you say Nala Badin, which we have over here. In other words, what's happening over here? We have this piyyut, which we're adding into the bracha of Magen Avram. There was once a time that we had psukim there. For reasons that we're not going to explore, those psukim got lost. And I want to highlight to you just how important these psukim really are to the original format of this piyyut. Because when you're adding material into a bracha, it needs to be me'ein the bracha. So where do you have in this entire, and we're obviously not going to read it together right now, but where do you have the relationship to Magen Avram in this particular bracha? So the answer is you get it in Na'alav Adin. Na'alav Adin, you'll notice it says the last four words are b'maginas re'im. Maginas Re'im, that's Magen Avram. Okay, this is the shield. So this is the link to the bracha. That's what makes this whole piyyut me'ein ha-bracha. Now what we want is we want the whole thing to be linked to the bracha. So how does that happen? Well, the Nala over here is linked to the last pasuk in the series, ended with the words Ma'od Nala. And then you had a whole series of psukim, and here the last word of the earlier part of the piyyut was Nifkada. So Nifkada led you into Vashem Pakad, and then that led you into a series of psukim, all that are connected with each other, that led you into the last word Nala, which brought you into the word Nala Bedin, which ends with B'maginas Re'im. That's Magen Avram. So now I could say, Baruch atah Hashem Magen Avram. This is the original piyyut, the way it was in all of these medieval machzorim. As I said, for reasons that aren't quite clear, the psukim came out. And so what happens is we end up having this two-liner over here. This two-liner is not a two-liner. This two-liner is the siyum of the original piyyut. And that's the big theme that you're going to see in this shir tonight, is that almost always when you have one or two lines, it is a part of a much bigger piyyut, sometimes of which we're not saying the whole thing, which is usually what's happening, and that's what's happening here. That's what's happening here as well. So that is the bracha that is being added. Once again, that's the bracha. That is the material that we're adding for the first one, for the magain, for the bracha of Magen Avram. Yeah. Yes, very good. So thank you for pointing that out. Yoresi bif tsoisi. I hope I said that right. Yoresi bif tsoisi is the last word is aschil, which makes it work with the first word of the magain, which is aschil, and that's exactly what happened. Is that, as I'm going to explain later, it's a Yoresi bif tsoisi is a late addition, relatively speaking, into the machzor, and when it gets added, it needs to work, it needs to fit. One kind of the ending of one thing needs to lead you into another thing, and that's very common for the machzor, and we're going to see that pattern again and again. Okay, so thank you for pointing that out. Now, let's go back to our machzor over here, up on the screen, and after we go, Baruch atah Hashem Magen Avram, we're ready to begin the second bracha of Shemoneh Esrei, which is Ata Gibar La'olam Hashem. And in this machzor, we immediately see there's a piyyut that begins with the word Ta'alas. Ta'alas. That piyyut that begins with the word Ta'alas, we do not have that piyyut. And this piyyut works the same way. It's called the Mechaya, because it's part of the bracha Mechaya Mesim. The first one is a Magain. This is the Mechaya. It's part of the Mechaya Mesim. It works the same way. You have a piyyut, you have psukim, and then you have the final two lines. But the key words are B'talalei Sechi. B'talalei Sechi is the key, because what's B'tzal Leisechi? Mechaya Amesim. So that's the same link. And then you notice how the exact same thing happens. You have a piyut. Let me take one more moment to make something clear. This one begins with a taf. The earlier one, Aschil, begins with an aleph. This runs through all the aleph bays. It begins with an aleph and it ends with taf. Okay? Which is a very standard way that a piyut would work, is it covers all the aleph bays. After he finishes the aleph base, he does the psukim. After he does the psukim, he has his 2 lines, including the catch, the link to the bracha Magen Avraham. Now we're in the second bracha. What happens? I did aleph through taf. Now I'm doing taf through aleph. So we begin with taf. We end with aleph. Now I have my series of psukim, and it's the same linkage. The last word in the aleph is netra. And that links to the pasuk Vayetar Yitzchak, which is also about having children, which is the theme of today's kriya. But if the first one was about Sarah, the second one is going to be about Rivka and Yitzchak. And then we have a series of psukim ending with the words Leven Melech, which leads us to the first word of the last 2 lines, Melech, and it ends with the words B'sala Leisechi B'chastoy Es Ba'era. Okay, here it's a little bit of a different girsa, but on the left-hand side, this is exactly what we have in our machzor as well. This is the structure of the second piyut, the mechaya. What is left for us? What is left for us is only those last 2 lines. And here, we didn't only lose the psukim, we lost the original piyut that began with taf and ended with aleph. We lost that as well. Then we say, and we say Baruch Atah Hashem Echai Amesim, and with that we finish the second bracha of Shemona Esrei. Okay, so now we're holding the third bracha. This is Ata Kodesh. So we need to have a piyut for Ata Kodesh. And guess what? We have the exact same series for a third time. And here, the way it's going to work, he already did aleph through taf. He already did taf through aleph. So what's he going to do now? He's going to do at bash on aleph, and then a taf, and then a beis, and then a shin. That's the series of the next piyut, which is called Even Chug. Do we have Even Chug in our machzor? No, Even Chug is not there in our machzor, and it concludes Even Chug in the same way, where you have the piyut. When it finishes the at bash, we have a listing of the psukim, and guess what? What is the last pasuk in the series? V'nemar Yimloich Hashem la'olam l'kayachtzin l'der halaluka v'ata kodesh yeshev tilis Yisrael. 2 psukim from Tehillim, and those are the 2 psukim that we have on the top of page 114 of your machzor. So the same thing happened, where we held on to a small piece of this, but here it's from the series of the actual psukim itself. It's not an additional 2 lines after. It's from the 2 final psukim. I should point out that whenever there's a series of psukim, it's always a mix of Torah, Nevi'im, and Ksuvim, similar to what we do in Machis, Zechrenis, and Shofros, or like Avarachmim on Shabbos. This was a standard thing. If you'll notice, when we have the psukim at the end of Avarachmim, it says in Torah, and as it says in Nevi'im, Uvechisvei Kodesh Namar. So this is a way, when you really want to prove a point, you need to show it in Torah, Nevi'im, and Ksuvim, and that's what's happening in each of these things. Where's the pasuk Yilmach Hashem La'olam in Ksuvim? Where's the pasuk in Tilim? Where's the pasuk V'ata Kodesh Yeshev Yisrael is in Ksuvim, in Tilim, and so therefore, that's the structure, and that's what we have over here with the Yimloich as well. Okay, now remember, this was all about leading us into Kedusha. And now is the time to say Kedusha. Kedusha is said before you say Ata Kadosh, that's when we say Kedusha. So therefore, if this was all about leading into it, we're not just going to suffice here with 1 piyut. Now we're going to really get our engines revved up, and we're going to start doing more and more and more. And so in our machzor we have an Atahu Alekeinu piyut. That piyut is not present in this machzor. It did exist in other manuscripts and other traditions in Ashkenaz. We're not going to spend too much time on that. What is the next item that we have in this machzor over here? The next item that we have in this machzor over here is Toyer V'Sariya, which on the right-hand side of the page, right in the middle, you can see the word Toyer V'Sariya. You have it over there. However, what you're going to notice is that it's 1 line. It says Toyer V'Sariya, and right under that there's a piyut. The piyut is called Ateres Mamlacha. And what is the chorus for that piyut? Toyer V'Sariya. Toyer V'Sariya is the chorus for that piyut. That entire piyut we do not have. All we have is the words Toyer V'Sariya lahachnes kol meriya v'suktash b'yeda le'ariya kadosh. I asked before, what's this one-liner? The answer is this one-liner is one line from a much longer piyut. It is the chorus of this piyut that is called Aderes Mamlocha. The next thing that we have in this machzor, under that, after that piyut Aderes Mamlocha is presented, after that piyut is presented, by the way, the name of the python is presented in this piyut for the first time. In other words, he gave you his first one, he gave you Aleph Beis. The second one, he gave you Tashrak, going backwards. Then he gave you an Atbash. Okay, now that I did three rodeos with you, now I'm going to tell you who I am. And he, in this piyut, spelled out in an acrostic, is the name Elazar HaKolir. We'll talk more about who Elazar HaKolir was if we have time. Now, Be'ez Hashem will have time. We'll talk about it more later on. What's the next item in this machzor? The next item in this machzor is 2 lines on the bottom of the page. Melech mamalet meira leyodei srua hakel kadosh. Melech Secher Achuz Keren Noira V'Kadosh. Those 2 lines. Those 2 lines are not randomly placed here. They are the chorus of the next piyut that you have on the top left, where it says Apid Nezer Oyom B'Shilush Kedusha Bayom. You're able to see we're actually talking now about Kedusha because we're getting closer to Kedusha. And then at the end of each line, it says, after the first one you say Melech Mamalet, after the second one you say Melech Zecher, and likewise for each one of these 2 lines are the chorus for these piyyutim. If you look in our machzor, you'll see that after Torah V'Siriyah we have Melech Mamalet, and after Melech Mamalet we have Melech Zecher. All 3 of these lines are choruses for other piyyutim. Torah V'Siriyah for one, Melech Mamalet and Melech Zecher for the second one, that is Apid. Then in our machzor we have Echein V'Hashem Pakad Asara Kasher Omar Tzatzoel Kein Pekoid L'Tov Hayom Kadosh. One line, you already know the trick. This one line is not one line. This one line is the chorus of a piyut. It's not presented here in this machzor, but it is presented elsewhere in other manuscripts. But you're going to trust me that it is a complete piyut. This is the theme. Remember, this is not the kriya of the first. V'Hashem Pakad Asara is the kriya of the first day. But so it is for the first day of Yom Tov, but it is a piyut that was not said in this particular tradition, and so that's why it's not over here. Okay. Now what happens is in our machzor, what do we have next? Shmoi Mefarim. Shmoi Mefarim in this machzor also does not appear here. And once we learn more about it, it's going to become so obvious to you. You're going to say, oh, duh, obviously Shmoi Mefarim doesn't belong on the first day. It only belongs on the second day. So how that transferred, we'll talk about that later. But that's why the whole long piyut to Shmoi Mefarim we do not have. So that takes you on page 115, 116, 117. All of that is all part of the long piyut to Shmoi Mefarim. So what is the next thing that we have? Yishbay Tevel B'Tzedek Ulumim, 2 one-liners. That also is going to be in this machzor, but not on the first day. It's part of the second day. So we're going to skip that. We'll come back to that later, which brings us now to Adirei Ayuma, which is exactly what we have over here on the screen. We have the piyut of Adirei Ayuma, Ya'adiru V'Koil. So let's now continue. We're focused on the first day of Rosh Hashanah. After Adirei Ayuma on this particular machzor, what do we have? We have Lekeil Oirech Din. And that's exactly what we have in our machzor as well. But after we say Lekeil Oirech Din, we go right to the line of Echein L'chas Al Kedusha. Now we're done. We said enough. We're happy. We go and we say, okay, now we can finally say our Kedusha. Well, that's not what happens here. Here you can tell something's happening because we have art here. And the word Melech is highlighted. And this makes sense. Remember, this is all about the build-up to Kedusha. So this last thing, this is the most important thing, and in fact, it's the longest piyut. And it begins with the word Melech b'mishpat, and it goes on, look, for a nice 2 pages, 2 pages, 2.5 pages, and basically, this is, to sum it up briefly, this is, instead of saying Nakdishach v'na'aritzach in 2 lines, this is 2 pages that essentially says Nakdishach v'na'aritzach, and when you finally finish this, you say, and now you can continue with the rest of Kedusha. So this is one long paragraph of Nakdishach. This was the main thing. That's why we all came here, was to do this, to get to this. This is the pinnacle. This is the main one. That's why it's the longest. That's why it's the artwork. In our machzor, we do not have it. There is a line added in here later that says, and that we do have. We have that one line, and that brings us into Nakdishach and Aritzach, and that is a summary of what happens on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, the difference between the way it is in our machzor and the way it is in their machzor. So it starts out with the score being like we have more, because at least in the original form of this machzor, Yoresi Bif Tzoisi and Misoid Chachamim is not in this original manuscript. So in that way we have more. But and then what happens is, for the first piyut, the Mogain piyut, we basically have the same thing, except we're missing the psukim. All right, not too bad. But then as the story starts to unfold, it becomes more and more aggressive, where we start shedding and we start losing, and suddenly there's these full pages that we don't have, and all of these one-liners that we say in our machzor are the small remnants and the echoes of these larger piyyutim that were once there. It's almost as if someone said, well, we're not going to say this whole thing, but at least we should say the most important part, or at least we should say the most memorable part. What's the most memorable part of a song? The chorus, right? So if something needs to go, let it be the other material, let the chorus stay. That's what it kind of seems like happening. This is the first day of Rosh Hashanah. If you don't mind, let's do the same thing for the second day of Rosh Hashanah. So you need to turn back, because the second day also begins on the same, on page 110. And let's see what we have over here in the second day. So now the second day, the artist here wants to let you know, second day deserves artwork, so it's going to have its melech. You already know what that is. That's going to be the Yoitzer. Okay, but first let's look at the image. The image is the Akedas Yitzchak. That is the Kri of the second day of Rosh Hashanah. And so on the left-hand side you have the Ayil, that is Nechaz Basvach Bekarnav. On the right-hand side you have Avram Avinu, yes, an animal face, attempting to slaughter, to do the Akedah. And there's the Malach coming out of the Shemayim, that is pointing to the Ayil, that is Nechaz Basvach. Okay, so that's the imagery for the beginning of the second day. What is the material here that we're looking at? I circled the word Yoitzer. In other words, this is the insert for Yoitzer Erev Cheshach. Okay, so we already know we don't say that. Then we go to the next page. We see over here that it says, where's the Oifin? The Oifin, the second one, remember, Zulas, the third one, they also didn't have. But Oifin, he says, the Oifin is the same one as yesterday, so I don't have to rewrite it. That's what he writes over here. And now we come to Kedushta. Kedushta, you already know what that means. These are going to be the piyyutim that we put into the first three brachas of Chazaras Hashatz, building up to Kedusha. Here, although we have Rishus, the second day we have Rishus, and it's not added in the margin. It's part of the body of this machzor. And this is going to heighten the question I asked before. How come Yaresi, where is that paper? Yaresi Biftsoisi. How come Yaresi Biftsoisi is not part of the original text? But here, the second day's Rishus is. Asisi L'chananach is the same function as the Yaresi Biftoisi. It's the idea, I'm the chazan, am I good, am I not good, I'm not sure, God, you're going to strengthen me, you're going to make me do this right. So we have the reshus of the chazan on the second day, but for whatever reason didn't have it on the first day. We're going to circle back to that and make that clearer as we go along. Again, Misoid Chachamim is not present over here because this machzor never has Misoid Chachamim, but again, other versions in Ashkenaz did have it at the time. So far we start off pretty well, because now we're pretty much in the same boat. We both have Asisi L'chananach. What comes next in this machzor after Asisi L'chananach, after the Rishus is finished, we move to the Mogain. The Mogain is the piyut that's central to the story of Magen Avram. It begins with the words Imrascha Tzerufa, and indeed we have Imrascha Tzerufa. If you're looking on page 111, 2 lines on the bottom in the Kahas Machzor, you'll see you have over there Imrascha Tzerufa. This is the Mogain. But then you already know what's going to happen, because the exact same thing that happened yesterday happens today. The last word, the Imrascha Tzerufa, by the way, it goes in Aleph Beis, the Seder of the Aleph Beis. And what's the last word when you get to Tav? Is Pakad. And what's going to be then? What are we going to have? A series of psukim. What's the psukim? Vashem Pakad. So they link with each other. We have a series of psukim. What's the last word of the series of psukim? Lachoisim boy. And then that leads you to the final 2 lines. Boy shu'anenu. And Boy Shu'anenu in the last few words has Kain Yagain, which is the theme of Magen Avram. So it's the exact same idea of building this train of one car leading to the next car, which justifies having this piyut, because it is, remember, this is important. If If you're adding piyyutim, there needs to be some connection to the bracha. Otherwise, there's no justification. Well, this is what happened over here. We have this material in total, except for those psukim, and that explains those random 2 lines over here. The boy shu ananu. If you want to know what those words are, that's pretty much linking the entire piyyut to the theme of Magen Avram, which justifies the existence of this piyyut. And likewise, we're going to see the same thing happen again. Now we finish Magen Avram, and we go to the bracha of Mechaya HaMesim, and so this piyyut is going to be called Mechaya. It's called Tamim Pa'alach. On the left-hand side of the page, you see the piyyut Tamim Pa'alach. Look by us. Look in our Machzor. What do we have after Umatzmiach Yeshua? We have 2 lines, Sfaseinu. We have 2 lines. We have Sfaseinu. That's all we have. And it leads into so in other words, same idea. We lost the entire piyyut. We lost the series of psukim when it came to the second one. And then we have Sfaseinu. There is the ending right there, with ends with the words Yikimenu v'nichya lefanav, which we have. That's Mechaya Mason. That links up with Mechaya Mason. And so, look, just like yesterday, we just preserved those last 2 words from the Mechaya. That's all we kept. Now, before we continue, I just want to show you the following, and that is there's going to be a pattern. The pattern is everything in this piyyut, in this second day, is going to be shin mem. I'm going to show you shin mems, and wherever you look, you're going to find shin mems. You're not going to be able to take your eyes away from shin mems. So what's happening in the very first piyyut, which is the reshus, after he finishes the aleph beis, he has the word shlach me'itcha. That's the theme of shin mem. I'm circling it over here. You're not going to have to find each one. You're just going to trust me. Likewise, in the next one, remember the word boy, shu ananu. So boy, we needed boy to link up to the pasuk. So we can't count the word boy. What's the very next word? Shu ananu and mem, shu ananu me'olam. So we have a shin mem again. If I'm not mistaken, every single one of these works is going to have a shin mem, as we are going to see. If you go to the next one, look. What is the last 2 lines of the Mechaya? Sfaseinu medovevois. Sfaseinu is the shin, medovevois is the mem. Okay, now we finished Baruch Atah Hashem Mechaya Mesim. Let's remember what happened yesterday. Yesterday at this point, there was a piyyut, psukim, that ended with yimloich. Piyyut, series of psukim, and yimloich. What did we have? Only, anyone remember what do we have? Only yimloich. That's all we had. When it came, right? When it came to the third one, there was a piyyut, psukim, ending in yimloich. All we had was yimloich. So here again, you have a piyyut. It begins with shulachti v'malachos. You already know. Shin. All right, there's a shin situation going on over there. You have a piyyut over here, clues with psukim, including Yimlech Hashem Le'olam. You would expect, what do we have based on yesterday? What should we have? Just Yimlech. What happened? We have shulachti. Here, we have the very first stanza. It's like 1 line. What's this 1 line doing? We have the very first stanza of this longer piyyut. Here it was preserved. This had a higher survival rate than yesterday's piyyutim that are in the exact same location, right after Mechaya HaMesim. And we have to wonder what happened over here. But you'll notice, I think the answer is, we opened the Aron for this piyyut. Now, whether they were opening the Aron in those days or not is a separate discussion, but the fact is that for a very long time we've been opening the Aron. It could be this was like a big highlight already. Especially the words over here is a chazan talking, and he's saying, I was sent, and Shema Hashem Kol Yakra. It could be the words were powerful, or because the minig to open the Aron for this particular piyyut made it kind of impossible to get rid of the whole thing, and so we just did what we do when we, in these situations, instead of getting rid of the whole thing, we just preserved a few lines from this. But when you see this shulachti, you need to remember, this is from a much larger piyyut, and yes, it's the shin that begins a pattern that we have again and again on the second day of almost many things, starting with shins and having mems shortly thereafter. In other words, shulachti is shin, and the next paragraph is medaber, b'tzedakah. So that's the mem. Of the shin, the significance of the shin, we're going to hold on to that, keep you in suspense a little, if you don't mind. Okay, so then we get to the Yimlech Hashem Li'olam, and now we start moving into the other piyyutim. Here is where this Machzor has Shmoi Mefarim, which we end up saying on both days, and now it's already worth pointing out, Shmoi Mefarim, this is shins galore, all right? Where do we see Shmoi Mefarim, right? You see? And likewise, all of these Oli, Shmoy Mefarim, Shin Mem, Shomer Mitzvah, Shin Mem, Shapar Masechet, Shin Mem, each one of these. Now, this whole Shmoy Mefarim is the chorus for Eider V'Hoid. And so here we have it on the second day, the whole Eider V'Hoid, which you see in your Machzor on pages 115 through 117. So let's blaze through that. And then we finish Eider V'Hoid. What do we have at the end? We have Yishbay Tevel B'Tzedek Ul'umi B'Meisharim Kadosh Hu V'Echad Mi Yishivenu. What are those two lines? So we have that right. Look, we have it for the first day on the top of page 118. What is it doing in our Machzor? It's two random lines. What's it doing here? You already know the answer. It's the chorus for a piyut that we don't say. Etein l'fa'alei tzedek. And at the end of each line, it tells you, Yishbait v'hu, Yishbait v'hu. That is when we're supposed. So here, we have the remnants of this piyut for the first day. In this Machzor, the remnants of this piyut is for the second day. Now, if you go under the line, in our Machzor for the second day, at this point, instead of saying Yishbait tevel b'tzedek, we say two other lines. What are the two other lines? Adaim imaisim ein banu, and hein lo yamin b'kdoshav. You already know what this means. Here you have a piyut. It says Adain and Hein Loi. There's a piyut called Shafti V'Ra'oi. Yes, it begins with a shin. And these two lines, Adain and Hein Loi, which in our Machzor is page 118 over here, is the chorus of that particular piyut. Again, rather than saying the piyut, we just say the chorus. And here, I just want to show you that even in this piyut, Etein L'Fa'alei Tzedek, after he finishes the Aleph base, he's doing shin. We're seeing the same shin work again over here. All right. Shafti Re'eh obviously is a shin. Okay. Once we finish that piyut, which we no longer say, so what do we have in our Machzor? We have Uvechein Vayivishur Melech, Melech Elyon. And that's what we're going to have. And after Melech Elyon, if you turn forward in your Machzor, after Melech Elyon, you turn to... you have Melech, after that you have Kol Shin'anei Shachak. So that they have it the other way around. Here it's Kol Shin'anei Shachak first, and after that it's going to be Melech Elyon. So it's just switch the order. We're not going to worry about that. Kol Shin'anei Shachak, obviously Shin, Shoichnei. You can look in your own Machzor. If you go to page 121, Kol Shin'anei Shachak is Shin, Shin, Aleph. Mem, Mem, Aleph. Okay? So it's very clear this whole shin pattern is continuing. And the same is true in the next piyut, which by us is Amitz Hamenusa. Go to the last paragraph. The last paragraph is a shin. Shoifet emes, ma'abadav emes. Shoifet is a shin. Ma'abadav is a mem. So the same exact pattern that is happening for the last paragraph of that. Okay? That's what I wanted to show here. And then, now we finish the piyyutim. Remember what happened yesterday when you finish most of these. Now we say, we have that over here. But instead of saying kedusha, remember we have that long nakdishach. This was what we were waiting for. We wanted to get to this. We wanted to say nakdishach now in 3 lines. We wanted to say it in many, many, many lines. And so we have these 2 pages over here, which 2 pages, 4 pages, and finally we conclude those pages saying V'kara zeh kakas hayanu yachav v'kara zeh zev yamar, and then we move into kedusha, and then we're done. He has nothing else to say over here. This is later. This is not. This is musaf. This has nothing to do with Shachris anymore. He's done. Okay. So now we could take a step back and say, okay, what happened over here? What do we see happen over here? In a nutshell, I think it's fair to say that almost everything, maybe everything is represented in our Machzor. Everything is a little bit of real estate in our Machzor, but boy, someone did a job of cutting things down in a very significant and serious way. All of the 1-liners and 2-liners that we have are remnants of these piyyutim, both from the first day and the second day. That's pretty much the summary of what we have. And the question is going to be how and why this happened. I'm not entirely sure we're going to answer these questions fully, but we're going to be able to understand, at least appreciate some of this partially. Yeah?
Ashkenazi has like 30, 40 pages more.
Yeah, so if someone is following the pure Nusach Ashkenaz, it means they'll be doing a lot of this today. Now, one of the things I should point out is we're focused here on two things: Chabad versus the old Minig Ashkenaz in the 13th century that we see on this document. There are so many other Nuschos, and each one of them has their own variations, but we're not going to have the time or the ability to discuss what each one of them are doing. Okay, so we are going to try to understand how this happened, and I'm going to try to explain that to the best of my ability, but I just want to take note of the remaining questions that we had. One odd question was the Rishus. The first day, no Rishus. Second day, yes Rishus. Why that inconsistency? And the second question I want to take note of is all those Shin and Shin Mems that we spoke about for the second day. We also mentioned the name Rabbi Elazar HaKoller. We said we want to talk more about him, which we'll get to soon. Okay, what we need to now do is the following. Let's actually engage in some of this material, answering some of these questions right now. So turn to the handout. There's a passage in the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch that we need to summarize. It's Erechayim Siman Samaches as follows. I need to move through this material quickly so that we we reach our goals. The Alter Rebbe here is discussing a machlokas amongst earlier Rishonim, whether it's a good idea to say piyyutim in Krishma. And he says, some people say yes, some people say no. The minig in Russia, the Alter Rebbe says, is to say them, but he concludes this segment saying, V'hamekel ve'enoi oimram lo hifsid. You lose nothing by not saying the yotzris. Okay. By the way, I should point out that if you look in our Chabad Machzor, look at the top of any page that you're in right now. What does it say? Yoitzer leyoim aleph shel Rosh Hashanah. This is the only remnant we have for the yotzers, because what happened was yoitzer, in a stricted sense, means just the addition for the first bracha. If you want to expand it a little more, you could say yotzers means the whole series that you put in, the yoitzer, the oifen, and the zulas. They could also be called yotzers. But eventually it became, because yoitzer is the first one, it became normal for people to refer to yotzers as all of these additions, even those that we know are really called kedushtas, they also called yoitzer. That's why it says on the top of your thing, yoitzer really is supposed to say kedushta or whatever it is, but that's the word. So we don't have any of this in Birchas Krishma, and notice the Alter Rebbe says in Shulchan Aruch, the Hamekel ve'eino oimram lo hifsid, no big deal if you don't say it. He then he talks about Shemona Esrei, and when he talks about the piyyutim in Shemona Esrei, he does not add those words. He doesn't say, and the person who's mekel and doesn't say. And in fact, when you read it, it basically sounds like by Birchas Krishma, it's debatable if this is a good idea or not. But in Shemona Esrei, it's not debatable, it's a good idea. What would be the difference between the two? Think about it. When you're davening on your own, in middle of Birchas Krishma, you're in middle of davening, and I'll make a hefsek here. Chazaras Hashatz means, I finished Birchas Krishma, I said Shemona Esrei, I did Oiseh Shalom, I'm done. Now it's Chazaras Hashatz, Sachakol. Chazaras Hashatz, everyone was Yoseh Tefillah. So the stakes are lower. Stakes are lower, so there's more room to get involved. So this may be an explanation of why it is that when it comes to the Kedushta, we have material. When it comes to Yotzes, we don't even have remnants. We don't have one lines. We didn't even do that type of job. This may be the explanation based on this Alter Rebbe, the Shulchan Aruch of the Alter Rebbe. Okay, who was Rabbi Elazar HaKoller? The Alter Rebbe brings in Shulchan Aruch, in the same Siman, in Siman Samaches, when he's trying to build up the reputation of these piyyutim, he says that Rabbi Elazar HaKoller, number one, was from Eretz Yisrael. Number two, he's from a town named Kiryas Sefer, and the reason that would be known is because in one of his piyyutim, he writes in the acrostic, the Kiryas Sefer. The Alter Rebbe then gives a third detail about his life. He lived during the time when they did Kiddush HaChodesh al Pi Ariyah. How does Alter Rebbe know that they did Kiddush HaChodesh al Pi Ariyah? We'll come back to that. He says immediately. The reason is because, look, he did not make any kroivis for the second day. Kroivis is another term, can't get into it, but basically the piyyutim that we say in Shemona Esrei are sometimes called kroivis, sometimes called kroivitz, but we're going to ignore that for right now. So there is no Rabbi Elazar HaKoller piyyutim for the second day of Yom Tov. Aha. Okay, where did Alter Rebbe get this material from? It comes from Tosfos. Tosfos Harosh and Braches, Daf Lamed Daled Amud Aleph says the same thing. Rabbi Elazar HaKoller was from Eretz Yisrael, number one. He's from Kiryas Sefer. In his day, they were Mekadesh L'Chodesh Al Pi Ariyah. Why? Because he didn't make any material for the second day. What does this mean? For Pesach, Sukkot, and Shavuos, you say, yeah, even today they only observe one day. He said, they make an argument here, so the Noda B'Yehuda, the Tzlach, explains what's happening over here and says as follows. The way it worked in those days was, today is Lamed El. I'm living in Eretz Yisrael. Today's Lamed Elul, it's possible that if they have a sighting of the moon, it's possible that they're going to declare today Rosh Chodesh. So what do I need to do today, Lamed Elul? I need to observe Rosh Hashanah. And so Yidden Taka observed Rosh Hashanah, and they prepared for Rosh Hashanah, and they wrote piyyutim for that day of Rosh Hashanah, and they observed it. However, says Tzlach, almost always, that day, Eidim Taka came and said, today's Taka Rosh Chodesh, which means that day was Taka the Val day of Rosh Hashanah. They sent Shluchim out, and if you live nearby, the Shluchim got to you that night or early the next morning, and they told you, yes, it's been confirmed that yesterday was Rosh Hashanah, so today, even though you woke up in the morning and you made your coffee in a way that's compatible with your Dinim on Yom Tov, guess what? It's not Yom Tov anymore, because yesterday was the real day, and so you don't have to keep it anymore. And this was the Seder, he brings sources that almost always, it was the Eidim came on that day, which is why it was only one day of Rosh Hashanah. Elazar Kala lived in Kiryas Sefer. He argues Kiryas Sefer is close enough for the Shluchim to have come. Elazar Kala got into this routine of where year after year is one day, and so when he wrote his piyyutim, he only wrote piyyutim for one day of Rosh Hashanah and didn't write anymore. If a person lived further away, then it's not a pashta ma'aseh. Why? Because now what a person needs to do is they have to do the same thing the first day. Did the shluchim come today? We don't know. Maybe they didn't come. So maybe today is Rosh Hashanah, and they need to observe that second day of Rosh Hashanah, and it's only going to be later that day, or the next day, or even a few days later, if they're going to find out if their second day of Rosh Hashanah was the Rosh Hashanah or not. So this is how he explains. He says, look, we, from the Elazar HaKolir, only have for Rosh Hashanah 1 day of piyyutim. Because we only have 1 day of piyyutim, it must be he lived in the time when they were Mekadesh HaChodesh Al Pi Ariyah using this type of system. So if you stop there, then you would say, okay, so now we know Elazar HaKolir lived. When they stopped doing Kiddush HaChodesh Al Pi Ariyah? Sometime in the 4th century. So that means he's living during that era. So that's that he's living early on. Then the Rosh continues and says, Yesh Oymerim, that he was a Tana. Some people say he was a Tana. And the Alter Rebbe brings that. The Alter Rebbe brings it in the same passage that some people say that he was a particular Tanya, and then it gets into a discussion about who this is. If it's a Tana, so Tanoim, Torah Yehuda Anasi, it's essentially meaning that he lived in the 2nd century. So that's who this Rebbe Elazar HaKolir would be. Now, if you stop there, you say, okay, it's open and shut case that Elazar HaKolir is a Tana. But it's nicht azay pashut. There were some Gedolei Yisrael that questioned whether this is indeed the case. The Yavitz in Moiruxia, Simin Kuf Yud Beis, says, I have a big problem with this. Why? Because for the Sukkos, we have piyyutim for 2 days. So this doesn't add up to say that he lived in the time. In fact, it doesn't add up that he's B'chlal in Eretz Yisrael. But that was the question that the Yavitz asked. Then he said another thing. I found in some of the acrostics, he's signing his name, Elazar ben Yaakov, and that doesn't add up. People who suggested he was a Tana said it's Elazar ben Reb Shimon. But I see in the acrostic, he's writing Elazar ben Reb Yaakov, so that doesn't add up. So because of these problems, he says, you know something? I have a better idea. He says, that there's a teaching from the Arizal, that he's a Gilgul of a Tana. So in other words, you have someone who lived in a later time and place, but his neshama was a neshama of the earlier person, and the Chida and Machzik Bracha supports this and says, he says, Tochazi kama tokiv chilayu, look how strong Tosfos is. Because Tosfos says, look, it's Elazar HaKolir is a Tana and is this and this Tana, and whether they realized or not, what they were essentially tapping into is the Torah of Gilgul, because although he lived later, he had that same neshama, so the Chida is blown away by this idea. So if so, here we have 2 Gedolei Yisrael who weren't really married to this idea that he was a Tana and that he was living in that particular time. There's one other important source that I think is worth mentioning in this regard, and that is the Rebbe's grandfather's grandfather. And that is, Rebbe's grandfather was Rebbe Meir Shlomi Anoski. His grandfather's name was Rebbe Avram David Lavut. He was a chassid of the Tzemach Tzedek and the Rebbe Marash, and then also in the beginning of the Nesius of the Rebbe Rashab as well. And he wrote a sefer on the Siddur that is known as Shara Koilo. And he has a discussion over there, the piyyutim, is it good for the Jews, is it not good for the Jews? And he says, well, some people say, look, Elazar HaKolir is a Tana. He says, look, none of these piyyutim are quoted in the Gemara. None of these piyyutim are quoted in the Medrash. None of these piyyutim are quoted in the Zohar. So I don't know. Because if it is indeed the case that Elazar HaKolir is a Tana, then we would think that some of these piyyutim would be quoted here. And so therefore he says, I'm not so sure that indeed Elazar HaKolir is a Tana. And he says, in fact, look at the Mefarshim of the machzorim, and you'll see they bring different shittas who Elazar HaKolir is. This is interesting. What does Rabbi Avram David Lavut mean when he says, look at the mafarshim of the machzorim? So I can't say I know for sure, but I think we know what this is. In the year Taf Kuf Samach, that's the year 1800, there was a man in Germany who's by the name of Wolf Heidenheim, who published a whole bunch of machzorim, and we spoke about him in previous classes. So he published there the Machzor, one of his machzorim he published that year. He also included major information about all the people who wrote piyyutim, including Elazar HaKoler, and there he brings different arguments of why it's hard to suggest that Rabbi Elazar HaKoler is a Tana or an Amoyer, including the fact that none of his piyyutim are quoted in these earlier sources, and that the first time we see Gdei Yisrael quoting him is the Rishonim, and so therefore he assumes, Wolf Heidenheim assumes, that he must be later. It seems that Shara Koilo, that the Rebbe Zayda, his Zayda seems to be using it and leaning on it in this particular case, and therefore, so we leave that with an open question about who Elazar HaKoler is. Either you date him as a Tana, 2nd century of the Common Era, or you put him a few centuries later. Then where? So that becomes scholarly guesswork. Definitely before Taisus, definitely the period. Yeah, you're dealing with a 500-year window. A 500-year window. There was those who thought that maybe, like Heidenheim himself thought that maybe he's a 10th century figure, but no one takes that seriously. Way too close. So you're dealing here with someone who is either a Tana in the 2nd century, or 300 years later, or something like that. This is who Elazar HaKoler is. Now you already have the answer to what all those Shin Mems were doing, and we're able to explain what happened with the Rishus. Remember who wrote the Rishus for the first day? The Yaresi Biftsoisi. Who wrote that? Rabbi Yukasil. I told you he lived in Spire in the 11th century. All the other piyyutim, it's an entire network. It's not random. It's a network written by who? By one man, Elazar HaKoler from there. Remember, first he did his Aleph Beis. Then he did his Tashrak. Then he did his Adbash. Then he told you his name. And he continued writing. This all is one long chain. He didn't do Rishus. He didn't do that. He didn't feel there was a need for it, and none of the Rishusim come from him, so he didn't do it. And that's why that Machzor Taka didn't have the Rishus, because he didn't author it. Someone else later said, hey, you need to have a Rishus, because later it became normal to have it. And so this Rabbi Yukasil created one that will fit in by making the ending of Chil that we Taka saw before. So now comes the 2nd day of Rosh Hashanah, and what are you in Germany going to do? So you say what you said yesterday. Come on, you don't want to do that. The whole idea of a piyut is embellish. You can embellish by repeating, even though we do some repeating today, but that's another story. Originally, they didn't want to do this repetition. And so, what are you going to do? Someone else needs to step up to the plate. And indeed, there was someone who stepped up in the plate. There's a passage in the Erzarua, that's text 8 on your handout, that talks about two Gdei Yisrael that lived at the exact same time. Rabbeinu Gershom Meir HaGoyla, you all heard of him, and Reb Shimon HaGadol ben Reb Yitzchak, you all didn't hear of him. No, I shouldn't say that. That was presumptuous. I'm sorry. You all did hear of him, but less so than Rabbeinu Gershom Meir HaGoyla. In other words, Rabbeinu Gershom Meir HaGoyla, we say he generally passed away around the year 1040. So the first half of the 11th century is this Reb Shimon, and he's called here Reb Shimon HaGadol ben Reb Yitzchak. This is a big man. Guess what? That explains all the Shin Mems. All those Shin Mems were part of a Shin, Mem, Ayin, Vav, Nun, because he put his name in all these piyyutim. The entire series of the 2nd day is Shimon, including the Shmai Mefarim. What happens is, and this is a Chiddush, that Shmai Mefarim spilled into the 1st day. It doesn't inherently belong there. Shmai Mefarim, anything that has Shimon's name is for the 2nd day, and it was originally for the 2nd day. The Rebbe writes in Sefer Menhagim that really doesn't belong there, but he didn't want to change it because he didn't hear from the Fita Kedem. We'll talk about it more. And so that's why we end up having it. And so now what happens is Reb Shimon did do a Rishus. He did do a Rishus, and that's why you have Asisi Lechananach, which ends with his name. Asisi Lechananach, Reb Shimon did. And that's what happens here when Yukasil said, hey, we have a beautiful Rishus for the 2nd day, we got to add a Rishus for the 1st day. So he created it. And then in this Machzor, they added it in onto the margins of this Machzor, and that's the story pretty much of the piyyutim for Shachris, the 1st day of Rosh Hashanah and the 2nd day of Rosh Hashanah. I believe we answered all the questions that we had. Okay. Now we come to the big question. The big question is, what was the process by which we have this Machzor that we're holding in our hands? What was the process? Who created it? Who made it? So some people may think, well, it's Nusach Chabad. Nusach Chabad comes from the Alter Rebbe. So all this comes from the Alter Rebbe. Maybe the Alter Rebbe sat down and made all these decisions about how this Machzor is going to work. Well, The answer is nishtazoi. Let's have a look at what the Alter Rebbe actually did. So, when it comes to the Siddur of the Alter Rebbe, it was always known that the Alter Rebbe's Siddur was printed for the first time in the year 1803, Tov Kuf Samach Gimel in Shklov. It was also known that already in the times of the Rebbe Rashab, there were very few of these Siddurim that were accessible. The Rebbe Rashab wrote that he's looking for one and he's having a very hard time finding a copy of the Siddur. Eventually the Rebbe Rashab did get his hands on the Siddur, but as far as we know, that copy is the only one in the world. And so for most of the 20th century, no one had access to that particular copy. And the first printing, if you wanted to know what did the first print of the Alter Rebbe Siddur look like, you didn't have it. We only could rely on printings from after the Alter Rebbe passed away. And so even though you sing something, even though it was published by the Mittel Rebbe, the always question is, yeah, but does that reflect the way it originally was? And that was pretty much the case until very recently. You need to remember, Siddurim are used, and therefore they don't have a very high survival rate. Whereas a Sefer, a Rambam, a Shulchan Aruch is used less, and so therefore these survive. So there are many Siddurim who we know were printed, and there's 0 copies left. This is very common, and so this happened as well to the Alter Rebbe Siddur. It was assumed that in the Schneerson collection that's in Russia, that the Russian government confiscated after World War I, it was assumed that there's a copy of a Siddur there. Some people thought they maybe saw it, but no one had access to it because the Russian government's holding on to it. Until one fine day in the year 2014, the Russians decided to put it online. And that's what you see over here now. On the right-hand side, you see it says Oisef Lubavitch. That's a sticker that was put on recently. In recent years, one of the times that the Mishlachas went from New York, they went with these stickers, and on every book that that was part of the collection, they put that sticker. So that's a modern sticker. And on the left-hand side, there's no title page in this Siddur. In the title page is mentioned, which is why you can't know for sure where it was printed and when. But in the Frierdiker Rebbe's handwriting, it says Siddur Admar Keniret Fushklov. Presumably, this is Tfush Shlav. And the reason we presume it's Tfush Shlav, because you go to the back page, here it has a name of the listing of all the people who worked on this book, and most of them are located in Shklov. Moreover, one of these guys here, this Menachem Nachum ben Shmuel, there's a book printed a few years later, and he writes Hakam for his father. And here he doesn't. So that means his father, and in another one he writes Zal for his father. So here, without Birchas HaMesim for his father, you're able to see it's before the year 1808. And so therefore, and we know it's Shklov, so it stands to reason this indeed is that first Siddur that was printed in the year 1803 in Shklov. Let's have a look at what the Alter Rebbe did in the Siddur when it came to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur as well. I should point out here, we only did Shachris as a test case. But really, if you follow this rule, the same thing applies for Musaf, with some variations. Obviously, there are differences and important differences. The same thing applies Yom Kippur. The same thing applies for all of these tefillas. It's pretty much the same principle, so we don't need to run through it for each one of these tefillas. So, the Alter Rebbe, after he finishes the Musaf L'Shalosh Regalim, he feels the need to give you the Hataras Nedarim. And on the bottom right of the page, you have over here Hataras Nedarim, and the ending of it is on the top left of the page. So that he gives you the Nusach of Hataras Nedarim for Erev Rosh Hashanah. Then he needs to give you the Shemoneh Esrei for Rosh Hashanah. The Shemoneh Esrei that you say Ma'ariv, Shachris, and Mincha. So he gives us the Shemoneh Esrei, and then it concludes. He gives us the Kiddush of Rosh Hashanah. He gives us the Yehiratzin that you say on the apple. And then for Shachris of Rosh Hashanah, what do we get? Remember, Shemoneh Esrei, the Shtilah Shemoneh Esrei we already had, because it's the same as Ma'ariv. What do we get for Shachris that's new? You get Avinu Malkeinu. That's what we have. I'm only giving you the first 3 stanzas, but he produces the whole Avinu Malkeinu, and then after that is Tkiyas. That is it. You want to know what the Alter Rebbe has to say about Shachris? The answer is, I'll give you the Shtilah Shemoneh Esrei, and here is Avinu Malkeinu. Okay. We have the Tkiyas presented. What about Musaf? What does Alter Rebbe give us for Musaf? So obviously he has to give us the text, the Machiyas, the Chrenes, Shofris, the Shtilah Shemoneh Esrei, which we have over here. Okay, but what about Chazaras Hashas for Musaf? Anything? Yes. There's 3 things I needed you to know about Chazaras Hashas and Musaf. When the Chazan's doing Koidim, there's a minig from the Rekeach to say Ata Areza. Let me give you that here. In the end of davening, we say Avinu Malkeinu Zchor Rachamecha. Let me give you that paragraph here, right before Uksoiv L'chaim Tovim Kol B'nei V'Risecha. Let me produce that here, because that's only said in Chazaras Hashas. It's not said in the Shtilah Shemoneh Esrei. And Uvesefer Chayim for Musaf. Also, we add a few psukim at the end, so I'm going to give that to you over here. And boom, we're holding Tashlach. This is all the Alter Rebbe has to say about Musaf. And by the way, comes to Yom Kippur, he gives you Kaparis, and then Kol Nidrei. Before you say Kol Nidrei, say this one line, the text of Kol Nidrei. By the way, there's different nuschos what the right text is. Alter Rebbe has nothing to say on the text of Kol Nidrei. He gives us the Shemona Esrei. Then Shachris, nothing. Shachris and Yom Kippur, the Alter Rebbe does not offer anything. Again, the Shemona Esrei, the Shtil Shemona Esrei, obviously. But Chazaras Hashat Shachris, zero, nothing. Okay? Then we come to Chazaras Hashat of Musaf, there's the Avodah. And here, when it comes to the Avodah, we're doing this serious. And he gives us the whole Avodah. It starts on this page, Tzadik Daled, and it ends on the page on the left. And then the Avodah ends. Sometimes you think Avodah takes you all the way to the end of Musaf. It's not true. The Avodah stops, and then you start Slichis. And so, it ends, Uvechein ma'nedar hoya kohen gadol b'tzeisoi b'shalom min ha'kodesh, and then the Alter Rebbe wrote, Ka'oya la'nimtach, remember that piyut? Ka'oya la'nimtach v'dorem, timtza b'machzor. You'll find it in the Machzor. I have nothing more to say. And Mincha and Ne'ilah. And this is what's happening here. It goes, I don't remember the number of pages exactly, but that's the Avodah. He gives you the entire thing. So now the question is, what did the Alter Rebbe want? What was his vision for what was supposed to happen? What do all these omissions mean? I'll give you two possibilities. There are probably more. One possibility is, I don't want you saying any of this. Just like you don't say Yoitzeris, and no one bats an eyelash today, you don't say Yoitzeris, so don't say any of this. I don't want you to say it. Chazaras Hashat should just be Chazaras. That's one option. Another option is that he was like, say whatever you want, you should say it, but for that you have machzorim. I'm not here to do that type of work, and so I'm not engaging in this type of material. So this turns out, as the Maisa is nishpashit. What is the truth? So let's see, sources are conflicting on this issue. Where do we see this? Well, I'll get to the sheet in a second. Let's fast forward. The reality is, there's no Chabad Machzor during the times of the Alter Rebbe. There's no Chabad Machzor during the times of the Mittel Rebbe, or the Tzemach Tzedek, or the Rebbe Maharash. And then, when it comes to the last few years of the Rebbe Rashab, in the year Tafresh Ayin Gimel, 1913, on the eve right before World War I, we get the following book that is printed, that's on the screen right now. Mea Sha'arim is Seder Tefillah L'chal Hashana. This is the davening. You can see the Alter Rebbe is mentioned over here. This is a Siddur of the Alter Rebbe. Who publishes a Siddur of the Alter Rebbe? We'll see in a second. Here it says on the bottom, over here, published by Chaim Eliezer HaKohen Bichovsky from Hummel, and Chaim Meir, the son of Chaim Meir Heilman. These are two very well-known figures in the Chabad world. They are not well-known figures in the Lubavitch world, and that's because the two are not the same thing. These are Kapus T'Chsidim, and these Kapus T'Chsidim are Chabad, but they're not. After the Tzemach Tzedek passed away, they followed one of the other sons, the Kapus there, and they are the ones who print this Siddur Mea Sha'arim, and you'll notice that in this part of the Machzor it says, Vilnilva Elav HaMachzor LaRosh Hashanah V'Yom Kippurim Mesudar Keseder Sha'oibrim HaChsidim that are Mispalel Nusach Rabbeinu HaKadosh Laman Lo Yitztarchu L'Dalig Me'inyan Le'inyan. In other words, what happened from during this era, what was going on in 1912 and 1911, if you're them, you have a machzor, and it's like, we say this, no, we don't say this, we move this, that, to turn the page this way. We're not going to have to do this anymore because we're printing a siddur, and at the end of the siddur, we're also going to be giving you a machzor. And then here's after the siddur, here's the title page of the machzor. And before the machzor begins, they write the following note. Let's read this note, and that's text 9 in your handout. Let's read what these men have to say about what they're doing in order to try to understand what happened over here. They write, Yadua she'etz alanash hamispalel in Nusach Rabbeinu, it is well known, all those who daven Nusach of the Alter Rebbe, which is known as Nusach Chabad, Mematim ba'amiris ha-piyyutim ha'aruchim. We do not say long piyyutim. Uma'at mehare omrim, we only say a little. They're saying this as a well-known, established fact. The reality is, Chabad Chassidim, what do we do before we even print this book? What is the de facto reality on the ground? The reality is we're not saying everything that our neighbors are saying. We cut down. It says in earliest form it's better to say less with kavana than to say more without kavana. At least when it comes to slichas and piyyutim, that is the case. And so therefore, this is what Chabad Chassidim are doing. Okay. Now this is the reality, they say, in the year 1912, 1910, 1905, as far back as they can remember. Is it endorsed by anyone? So they continue. Ubevadai masha oimrim mikubul etzel aveiseinu shekein hayu oimrim etzel rabbeinu hagadol. We have a tradition that what we say or what we don't say comes from the Alter Rebbe. Wow. So all of a sudden, what we're hearing over here is Chabad says very little. And by the way, where did this happen? It's a Kabbalah, it's a tradition that traces itself back to the Alter Rebbe himself. That's what they're saying. But then they continue and say, it's been many years, and they hear a lot of people saying, if only we could print what everything that we say, bekuntris miyuchid, leman lo yeh bilbul be'esha oimrim. There's a big problem. Although we have this tradition, everyone knew, do Chabad, we say this, we don't. There's a bilbul, and when you come to davening, it's confusion, it's chaos. So we realize, something, we really want to do something. Pay attention to these words. It was hard for us to do it. What does that mean? What does it mean it was hard for us to do it? It's hard to print a book? It's expensive? It can't mean that. Okay, but we'll come to the solution in a minute. Then we saw someone did it already. Someone added the nusach of the piyyutim that Chabad says into Sidurim. So then what's the problem? Because they didn't do a good job. Why? Because they printed in a small font, and many things that you're supposed to say, they took out. And many things that you're not supposed to say, they put in. All of a sudden we notice over here that therefore there's a need for us to step in and to do it right. Larger font and also the right piyyutim. What do you learn over here? They said a moment ago, there's a tradition from the Alter Rebbe of what exactly we say. Here we realize, nishtazai pashut. Why? Because there were other people who printed kontresim of machzorim. I don't know who these people are. And they added it to a certain sidurim. And they did a similar idea of changing around the machzor, cutting it down, but their system was not the same that these chevra did. So in other words, among chassidim now, we're hearing the idea that there wasn't just one way, this is how we do it. Maybe there's a majority, and maybe they have the majority, I don't know, but there are definitely other ways of doing it, and that's why they say, we need to fix this. Okay, so what was bothering them? Why did they say we couldn't do it, but then when we saw other people doing it wrong, then we said we could do it? I think the beer is, I'm not 100% sure, but I think the beer is, there was a reason this was an oral tradition. Because what Hasidim did to the Machzor was a novelty. This was a breakthrough. This was a disruption. You had a kehillah in Eastern Europe that while there were variations, more or less, they said everything. A little more, a little less, or whatever. There was and that was why the Veltische people came to Chassidim. And now the Chassidim have this tradition of Taka saying less. Now we're going to print it in a book. You know what the Masnagdim are going to say about this? We had enough tzaddis about the Shinoi Nusach HaTfilah. Now we're going to do this also. I think that's why they said they didn't want to touch this. But once it was already done, and they saw there wasn't a Vayitz Aku, and no one said anything, and no one cared. It's not 1798 anymore. It's 1913, and they saw nothing happen. So they said, something, we'll do it. Befrat that they did it wrong. I think that's the pshat over here of what happened. Okay. Then they go on to say that there's another genre, and that is there are people who did the opposite. They printed the regular traditional machzor with all the piyyutim there, and the tfilis they made nusach hari. That's, in other words, earlier what they were talking about is someone who made just cut down piyyutim for Chabad, and they said they did a bad job because they chose the wrong piyyutim. Now they go on to say there's another genre of people trying to accommodate our market, and that is they say, you daven nusach hari, good. Let me give you all the Ashkenazi piyyutim with a nusach hari davening. And that's what you have here as an example of this published in 1906. It says, Machzor Rosh Hashanah v'Yom Kippurim, according to the nusach hari. What's the nusach hari here? Just the davening. The Baruch Sha'amar is nusach hari. But when you come to the piyyutim, we're not going to go through it right now. You'll see that it's basically the typical Ashkenazi piyyutim that were going on. They say, that's also not good. That doesn't work out. And especially they messed up in Yishtabach and in Vayavarach David. They didn't follow exactly the Alter Rebbe's nusach, and so therefore they have a mandate and they publish their machzor. What does it look like? This. Now, if this looks familiar, to you? There's a good reason for that. And that's because eventually this actually becomes, the Chabad Machzor that's published in America is literally photocopied from this Machzor that they published in Tov Reish Ayin Gimel. On how that happened, we'll talk about later. But that's what this is. This is their Chabad Machzor. Okay, if we stop here with this information, what do we have? We have a claim that the Alter Rebbe endorsed a certain nusach, and that they have it, and they're finally publishing it in the year 1913. Though we were also, if we read well enough, we were able to see, number one, there's a certain fear about actually publishing it and making it official. It's one thing that's Baal Peh, but official. And we also saw there was actually dissent. Not everyone agreed about what Chassidim do say and don't say. Okay, now the question is, we need to look at more voices, because we need to add more voices to this question of what did the Alter Rebbe want. So far, what we have from them is the Alter Rebbe wanted you to be saying piyyutim, and pretty much the exact ones that we're saying today. And let's go back to Rebbe Avram David Lavut. Rebbe Avram David Lavut, the Rebbe's grandfather, he pretty much held the same opinion. He writes that the Alter Rebbe, this is number 10 in your handout, he writes that the Alter Rebbe didn't bring all of the slichis, pizmonim, and piyyutim because he had nothing new to say about them. And if he had nothing new to say about them, he said, if you want to say them, follow your minig, and you'll find it in another book. And then he says a very important line, Deloi ka'atoyim loymar. Unlike those who are mistaken and say, Shakol masha loyhevi ba'asidr ein la'amram, that whatever is not in the siddur you shouldn't say. What do we hear? Rabbi Avram David Lavot, writing in the late 1800s, is saying, there are people who are mistaken. Okay, he's saying they're mistaken, but let's listen to what they're saying. They say the other thing. The Alter Rebbe doesn't have any of this in the Siddur. It means the Alter Rebbe doesn't want you saying it at all. He disagrees. He says they're wrong. The Alter Rebbe just didn't bring it because you don't need him for that. You go to the Machzor. What's his raya? He says the raya is ka'oyel nimtach. Go back here. The Alter Rebbe wrote ka'oyel nimtach timsa b'Machzor. In other words, the Alter Rebbe is sending you to the Machzor. Clearly, he wants you that you should be saying those piyyutim, and that's the evidence that he brings. In another place, in Shara Koilo, he adds another. Why is this the only place the Alter Rebbe tells you to say Koilo? Why didn't he tell you to say other stuff? Why is this the only one? So he explains, this is very simple. The Alter Rebbe brought the Avodah. Why did the Alter Rebbe bring the whole Avodah? Because there's the Ashkenazi Avodah, and there's the Sephardi Avodah. And although almost all of our Machzor is the Ashkenazi Machzor, when it came to the Avodah, the Alter Rebbe wanted that we should say the Sephardi Avodah, which begins with Ata Kananta. It was not written by Rabbi Lazar HaKoller, it was written by someone else. And the Ashkenazim, they have their own Avodah. So therefore the Alter Rebbe felt that he has to write out the whole thing, because this is really important, and he wants you to say the right nusach, so he wrote the whole thing out. So now you're going to think, oh, I'm in the Sephardi Machzor. Let me continue with the Sephardi Machzor. So the Alter Rebbe has to come and tell you, back to the Ashkenazim. That's how Rabbi Avram David Lavut learns it. That's the Ashkenazi piyyut. That's what we're saying. Yes, we had a little bit of a honeymoon with the Sephardim over here for 5 pages, but it's over, and now we're going back to the Ashkenazim. And that's why only here he says it. But really, if you ask Rabbi Avram David Lavut, the Shara Koilo, the Alter Rebbe wants you to say all of these piyyutim. So now we have 2 voices. We have the Kappas T'Chsidim saying the Alter Rebbe wanted the piyyutim. We have that from the Kappas T'Chsidim, and that the tradition that we have comes from him, it's endorsed by him. And we have Rabbi Avram David Lavut, a very important pasuk, saying that the Alter Rebbe wanted this and brings this evidence from the words K'oyel Animtach B'Darei Maila. So it sounds like it's a slam dunk, right? This is now, it's pretty much, it's an open and shut case. Well, it's not. And that is because when we look at the Rebbeim, we see a whole other story over here. And without going too much into the details, I'll summarize as follows. There is Eidos about the Mittel Rebbe, there is Eidos about the Tzemach Tzedek, and there is Eidos about the Rebbe Rashab, that all 3 of these Rebbeim, at least the Eidos is all in Yom Kippur, did not say the Slichis that's after the Avodah, and sometimes it says the piyyutim. So for example, in Teira Shalom, if you look at number 12, it's talking about the Tzemach Tzedek over there, and it says, Yom Kippur lo higit shum piyyut. I know it's only Yom Kippur, but for me, to say that only Yom Kippur and it doesn't apply to Rosh Hashanah, that doesn't make sense to me. So I think it's referring to Rosh Hashanah as well. That's the Eidos about the Tzemach Tzedek. And the Mittel Rebbe is said in a Maisa that he said Tehillim. This is reported in the Shemas Dvarim by Rabbi Chitrik, volume 1, page Kus Samach Tes, and we see over there that also the Rebbe Rashab, same thing. In the Rebbe's Rishimis, in the year Tafrei Sadekeh, he writes that he heard from the Frierdiker Rebbe that the Rebbe Rashab was still doing koydim, that we do v'akoyanim. He was still doing koydim, and the whole kila finished the slichas already. So all that material wasn't being said. And in fact, we have from the Rebbe as well, in Yemei Bereishis, it says at the very first year in Tafshin Yud Aleph, when the Shliach Tzibur on Yom Kippur was saying the piyyutim, the Rebbe busied himself with saying Tehillim. Interestingly, and I don't have an explanation for this, in the Rebbe's Rishimis, the Rebbe brings many minhagim to the Frierdiker Rebbe, what he did on Yom Tov. Many minhagim about Rosh Hashanah, many minhagim. Not one word about what the Frierdiker Rebbe did about the piyyutim. Whether he said it, whether he didn't say it, I don't know. To me, that's very bizarre that the Rebbe commented about so many things, and about the piyyutim of Rosh Hashanah, about the Frierdiker Rebbe and Yom Kippur, that we have nothing. But all of a sudden, we have all of these instances where the Rebbeim themselves are not saying piyyutim. That's what so now all of a sudden, we start leaning in the other direction. But it gets more. Because Rebbe Avram David Lavut gave his sefer to the Rebbe Rashab to review. The Rebbe Rashab was a young man at the time. It was in 1887, and the Rebbe Rashab sent him back a letter, and this is printed in Igros Kodesh of the Rebbe Rashab, volume 1, pages 17 and 18. And he basically said, I disagree with what you write about the slichis and the piyyutim and the pizmonim, because I heard from a reliable person whose name is Rabbi Binyamin Chaim of Leadi. He was 7 when the Alter Rebbe passed away, but so maybe he's not old enough to remember the Alter Rebbe, but he knows for sure that in the Alter Rebbe shul, they didn't say slichis on a Tainus Sibur. They didn't even say Avinu Malkeinu in the Tainus Sibur, which is not what we're doing today. Today it's common for Chabad. Rebbe Rashab means to say, today in the 1880s, it's common for Chabad to say Slichas on Tainesim. It's common for Chabad to say the Avinu Malkeinu Aruch on Tainesim. Well, guess what? This was not what was happening then at that time. He doesn't go further to say it about piyyutim, but I think we get the drift, where the Alter Rebbe, because he's disagreeing with what Rebbe Avram David Lavut wrote as a general statement about Slichas, piyyutim, and pizmonim. And the lashon is oisan in the letter. Ulafi daiti oisan ha pizmonim shalohevi b'siddur. This the pizmonim he didn't bring in the siddur. Bevadai ein la amram. We don't say it. And then there's a letter from Rabbi Yankel Landau, who was by the Rebbe Rashab, and he wrote to the Rebbe his zichronis. And in one of these letters, he writes that the Rebbe Rashab told him that Rabbi Avram David Lavut said that because it says that means you should say machzor. Is a raya? No, I disagree with him. That's not a raya. And he didn't explain why it is. And it's a very strong raya that he's sending you to the machzor. But nonetheless, the Rebbe Rashab said that he does not agree with this. So all of a sudden, we realize we have a much more complicated picture. Let me try to tell you how I understand it, and with this, we'll wrap it up. What happened by the Alter Rebbe is not entirely clear. Not entirely clear. But it does seem that throughout the history of Chabad, there were more than one voice on this issue. There were those, it seems that Rebbeim and others as well, who said you don't need to say machzor. You're not supposed to say machzor. This is reflected in the Shara Koilo, who he calls them toyim. You're not supposed to say machzor. And the Rebbeim we see. But what were the Rebbeim doing? This is really important. The Rebbeim were saying Tehillim. They were being ma'irich in their tefillah. It wasn't a question of piyyutim versus tennis. It was a question of piyyutim versus being ma'irich b'tefillah, piyyutim versus tilim and the like, and that's going to be an important point that we're going to come back to in a second. So one voice was the voice of those who were skeptical about piyyutim. That's one kav. The Rebbeim seemed to be there. Did they push it? Did they advocate it? Did they teach it? No, lav dafka. In fact, we don't have any evidence that they did. But there was that voice, and it wasn't only the Rebbeim, because the Shara Koilo says that there are others who think that way as well. So that's one school. Then you had another school said, no, we're supposed to do some. We're supposed to do some. And this tradition evolved and developed of the sum that they published in the year 1913. To say that it came endorsed from the Alter Rebbe is shver based on everything that we're hearing from the Rebbe Rashab. Is shver to say that. So lav dafka that actually occurred, that the Alter Rebbe endorsed it. But the reality is that there were Chabad Chassidim throughout the 19th century who said, yes, we should be doing some, but within that, I showed you, it wasn't one voice. Because there were other people who published, and they published a little different. The common denominator is we don't say everything, we need to reduce. That was pretty much the three views that existed. And within Lubavitchers, you had this as well. Now, what's going to change? What's going to change? Hold on. Here we have to get to this part of the story. What's going to change is in the year 1941. In the year 1941, the Rebbe is printing a new siddur. And when he's printing a new siddur, he's also printing a machzor. This is the first time that Chabad Lubavitch is printing a machzor. Chabad Lubavitch had never printed a machzor till then, as you see in the whole story that we're relating here tonight. Now, we have actually records of the Rebbe's process here. He had a whole bunch of questions about the Siddur and the Machzor. He listed them on a paper, and he went to the Fidik Rebbe and asked them and wrote the response. And those cards with the question and the response were published a few years ago in this book, in the Sefer. It's called Hagoyis L'Siddur Torah and basically what you're able to see is the question is Seder HaMachzor, what should it be? And then he went to the Fidik Rebbe and he heard the answer. And here is the important answer. B'chlal, generally, K'moshe B'siddur Mea Sha'arim. Here's where the Fidik Rebbe said, we're going with the Kappas Machzor, and we're basically going to go like that. Levad, except there's a few changes in Musaf, not much. A few changes that were made, and what happened was in Tafshan Aleph, a few changes. The next printing, the Rebbe introduced a few more changes, and over the years there were a few slight changes that were introduced to this Machzor, but more or less, the Chabad Machzor published in the 40s, 50s, and thereafter is pretty much this, based on what? Based on the Ira of the Fidik Rebbe. And so therefore, for us, what is this Machzor? Essentially, we can say, is that there was a tradition, an oral tradition. We need to cut down on piyyutim. Not all the Lubavitchers were on board, including the Rebbeim, at least for themselves, and at least for some weren't on board, but there was this type of machzor. But came 1941, the Fidik Rebbe made the decision and said, we should do this, we are going to do this, and we're now going to codify this tradition, and this is going to be something that we're going to do. One possible reason explanation is because, are people really going to be saying Tehillim instead? Are people really going to be Ma'arich B'Tefillah? No? Probably not. And so if not, then since this is so standard Am Yisrael, and there is this tradition on Chassidim doing it, so this is perhaps something that we should be doing. And that's a very interesting story, because if you have the way the Rebbe Rashab is saying it, where the Alter Rebbe doesn't put it in his Siddur, and means we shouldn't be saying this. The Alter Rebbe had this certain vision for what a Rosh Hashanah was supposed to look like, what a Yom Kippur was supposed to look like. So intense, so deep with Tehillim and being Ma'arich B'Tefillah and all that, which wouldn't have left a place for these types of piyyutim. But ultimately, that's not the voice that won. It seems that Chassidim weren't really willing to accept that. And they said, we want to do some, but not all. And that was the compromise. And that was a compromise that existed orally. It wasn't official. It becomes official in 1913 with Kapust. It becomes official for Chabad Lubavitch in 1941, which is what we have today. So my concluding statement for all this is, I think what I did here is give you a framework. Now I think we have a little bit of an understanding of what's happening in the Machzor. And when you have the understanding of the framework, all of a sudden, if you look at a keta, and you say, now I want to understand the Pirush HaMilah, this is all that meaningful. Because if you don't know what's going on, and you look at the Pirush HaMilah, you're like, okay, so I know what those lines mean. But now you are empowered to know what those lines mean in a context of what these Paitanim were trying to do, and I think that can make for a much more meaningful Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, Achsiv Achsim HaTeva, L'Shana Teru Mesukah.